All right. Thanks everybody for coming. It's nice to see so many people here. And hello to everybody on Zoom. Thanks for coming to what I've been affectionately calling my academic bar mitzvah. So I appreciate all of this. I'm excited to share a little bit about the work that I've done over the last couple years. A little bit of housekeeping just to get started. Let's save all of the questions till the end. So we're going to have time for Q&A right at the end, but just for the sake of flow and all of the projects moving into each other, let's keep all the questions till then. For now, I'm going to talk about my work on improving human autonomous vehicle interaction in complex systems. So let's start out with an unfortunate fact. People are terrible drivers. Every year in the US, there are 6 million car crashes resulting in 2.5 million injuries, 40,000 deaths, and $340 billion worth of damages. And beyond that, our driving instruction practices are archaic, and issues like phone use are only getting worse. Current estimates suggest that about 94% of crashes are the result of human error. I was actually driving in Los Angeles last month, and the driver next to us in downtown LA traffic was watching YouTube at the wheel, which is absolutely insane. Now, autonomous vehicles, or what we will call AVs, are one potential solution to these problems. And in the last few years, we've seen huge advancements in AV technology. In some cities like San Francisco, you can see autonomous taxis driving around and picking people up. Now on the screen here is an example from Waymo, which is Google's self-driving car company. Now, AVs have a lot of benefits: safety, environmental efficiency, less traffic, or my personal favorite, which is letting you take a nap at the wheel. Unfortunately, many of these benefits are blocked by unresolved informational needs. People want to know what the AV knows, they want to make sure it can perform in different contexts, and they want to know why it's making decisions. This is such a big problem for companies like Waymo that they spend most of their advertising budget trying to convince people that their cars are trustworthy. But the bottom line is, without actually meeting people's informational needs, people won't trust the vehicle and they won't ride in the car. So let's take a look at this news clip from LA a few weeks ago that sort of illustrates this point. I saw this and I was like, I need to include this in my presentation. And the sound is going to come through this little speaker here. Hopefully we can all hear it. To people on Zoom also, I hope you can hear this.
It's circling around
Oh,
a
it
parking
seems like
lot.
it's actually disconnected. Huh. Well, you know what? Let me connect to our speaker system again real quick, just to make sure we can actually hear what's going on. I think I let it sit for too long. Pause, everybody. This is why we always love technology. Okay, now it's back on again. Okay, let's take a look at this news clip.
It's circling around a parking lot.
Okay, it
I got
doesn't
my
seem to want to
seatbelt
be
on. I
connected.
can't get out the car. Has this been hacked?
Um,
What's going on? I feel like I'm in the movies.
In a video that's now gone viral, he says the Waymo turned like a top at
well, it's
least
actually
5 times before.
Let's do this a different way. Okay. Thanks everybody for. There we go.
It's now gone by. He said the Waymo like a top at least 5 times before customer service was able to get under control or something. Even him teams his concerns.
Okay, so I love that video because it's really clear what some of the problems are. Not only was the car malfunctioning, but beyond that, the rider wasn't empowered to know what was happening, why it was happening, and they lacked complete agency in how to fix the issue. Now, this is a consistent problem with autonomous vehicles. Even when the car is driving completely normally, people need to have agency, understand what's happening, and they should not have to rely on blind faith. So once again, if AVs can't meet people's informational needs, they will fail. So why is it so hard to meet people's informational needs? Well, one reason is it's just not very well studied how to convey the right information in the right way at the right time to help people meet their informational goals. Now, these include goals like building trust or understanding how an AV makes decisions, but also more futuristic goals like learning to drive from an AV driving instructor. Oh my God. We're having so much fun today, guys. Okay, there we go. Um, Also more futuristic goals like learning to drive from an AV driving instructor, which is something that we're going to actually talk about in a little bit. Now, how to convey information to meet these types of goals remains an open question. Now, in cognitive science, we often talk about this as a situational awareness problem, where there's a gap in the rider's ability to perceive, understand, and respond to what is happening in our environment, or in this case, with the vehicle. There's also a gap in the AV's situational awareness. It needs awareness of how to support its human teammate. So putting this in terms of what is called joint action, the human and the AV together need to work and collaborate to achieve a shared goal. So this requires each one to understand what the other one needs and what they need to do to compensate. So we can imagine a checklist where there are informational needs that need to be met, and when we satisfy those needs, goals are achieved. Now, in the work that I'm going to present today, we're going to discuss how we can build up an AV's understanding of the outside world and of their riders so that it knows how to communicate in order to check those boxes. Now, adding to this challenge of designing effective AVs is that the riders are real people driving on real roads in potentially life-threatening situations. So as a result, designing AVs that can meet informational needs depends not just on the goal of the interaction, like getting safely from point A to point B, but also who the rider is, what are the abilities of the AV, and what is the driving context. So it's easy to imagine that grandma may have different needs than her 16-year-old grandson, and that interactions may need to change when an AV is driving in a blizzard versus driving on a sunny afternoon. Now, the major implication here is that when aspects of the system change, so do the informational requirements, so do those checkboxes that need to be met. Now, unfortunately, most human AV and human AI research and design today in general treats all people and all situations as if they're the same. One of the reasons is because it's really difficult to account for the complex system of interacting parts. But if we break off chunks of this system bit by bit and study them, then there's a lot of opportunities to make these systems better. This leads me to my thesis statement. I propose that we can design AVs that better meet people's informational needs by accounting for the complex systems within which interactions occur. And by taking this approach, we can learn how to communicate better and how communication should change when aspects of the system change, like for different people or different driving contexts. Now, this is obviously a huge goal, so let's get concrete. How can we study interaction in the human AV system? And in my own work, I've done this from a few different perspectives. The first study I'm going to talk about is from the perspective of communication design. The second study takes two perspectives, system performance and driving context. And the third study is from the perspective of human traits. Now, specifically for communication design, that first study, the question that I set out to answer was, can we optimize an AV's communications to teach a person to drive a race car? Now, this study is special and a little bit different from the rest because it was the first study that we did with AVs, and it ended up opening up all sorts of questions about this human AV complex system. So both studies 2 and 3 follow up on this work. From the perspective of system performance and driving context, we wanted to know what happens to trust if the car's communications mess up, or if the driving context suddenly changes into a high risk or complex environment, like from a clear day to a blizzard. And from the perspective of human traits, we wanted to know if we can use a person's traits and concerns to predict their trust in AVs. Now, the real thing that makes research like this cool isn't just the studies themselves, which I'm biased, but I think these are just kind of cool on their own. but also that we can use this type of research to improve human AV interaction. So when I'm asking if an AV's communications can help a person learn to drive a race car, what I'm really doing is I'm exploring how communications can meet novel informational goals like learning and build our understanding of how to optimize communications based on a person's cognitive limits and abilities. For the second study, when I'm asking about the impact of errors and context on trust, I'm really trying to assess the consequences of deployment. What is at risk and how does this risk change based on the driving environment? This can lead to a deeper understanding of the impacts of system performance, the implications of different types of communications, and take a step towards context-aware design. And for the third study, when I'm asking how do traits predict trust, I'm trying to get a deeper understanding of the foundations of trust judgments, which can give us a step towards personalized and more accessible communication design. Now, in all three of these cases, we take chunks of the complex system and use it to improve some aspect of human AV interaction. And this impact is what gets me really excited about this type of research and why I decided to focus on this for my PhD. And my philosophy is when we account for the system, we can make AI systems in many different domains, even beyond self-driving cars, usable, safe, and viable to solve real-world problems. And something that I'm really excited about is, as of 2 weeks ago, as Nadir mentioned, all three of these projects are either published or accepted to be published in peer-reviewed scientific venues. So the first project is already published in a special issue on engineering human-machine interfaces in scientific reports. And the last two were just accepted 2 weeks ago to the CHI Conference on Human Factors, which is this upcoming April in Japan. So all of these three studies are sort of validated by the community, which is something that I'm very excited to be able to say during my defense. Okay, let's start with this first perspective, communication design. The question that we asked was, can autonomous vehicle communications help a person learn to drive a race car? And in this case, I built an AI driving coach while working on a research team at Toyota Research Institute and tested its effectiveness in a super cool driving simulator. So why do we study learning? Well, knowing how to communicate for learning can help us design optimal ways to transfer information to a person, which is especially important for new riders and for teaching people how an AV makes decisions. This is foundational for meeting a bunch of our informational goals, including building trust and developing situational awareness. And there's also a really cool practical application. If we understand how an AV can effectively transfer its expertise, we can take a first step towards building an AV driving coach, which is what we did. So why did we choose racing? Well, stepping back to this idea of the complex system, our interactions with an AV are going to be sensitive to who the people are and what their cognitive state is at the time of the interaction. So racing lets us objectively test our coach in a domain where adult drivers had little expertise and where cognitive load, or what we can think of as mental exhaustion and driving intensity, would be quite high. This lets us understand how to design within cognitive limits and generalize our findings to even the most extreme real-world contexts. And so in many ways, this work draws inspiration from Herbert Simon, who famously said that the best way to learn about a system is to understand how it functions at its limits. This study took place in a full motion driving simulator in Toyota's headquarters in Los Altos. And during the study, participants observed an AI driving coach explaining how to drive a race car while it autonomously drove around an exact simulation of a real racetrack in Northern California. And we wanted to see how exposure to this coach would impact a participant's ability to drive a race car on their own. And I'm happy to give more details about how we built the AI coach itself during the Q&A session. So it's actually kind of fun. So someone should ask me about that. Okay, the main purpose of the training was to help drivers learn vehicle positioning, which is a concept called the racing line. And this is often counterintuitive and challenging for new racers. And because we wanted to test different types of information or displays and find which ones were optimal, the coach presented different types of information to different people so we could compare. The communications varied by the presentation modality and information type. So for presentation modality, auditory information was said out loud using Amazon Polytext-to-Speech, while visual information was projected onto the road ahead of the vehicle. For information type, what information described what the vehicle was doing, like keeping to the left, and why information gave rationale for why it was doing it, like we're keeping to the left to preserve momentum around the curve. And using the simulator, we were able to measure all sorts of stuff from how well participants drove to their real-time cognitive load or mental exhaustion. We split people into 4 groups to compare the effects of different communications. A control group just watched the coach drive with no explanation of what it was doing or why. An auditory what group received only out loud descriptors of where on the track they should drive, like keep to the left, while an auditory what and why group got the same out loud descriptors of where they should drive, as well as this why rationale for why that position is ideal, like because you want to preserve momentum. The last group tested the impact of information modality by substituting the auditory descriptors of where to drive with a visualization of the vehicle's projected path. These people still got why rationale in the auditory fashion. Okay, I'm going to show you an example of what that visual what auditory why group saw in the simulator.
We get near the inside curve at the apex.
Oh, okay.
Or
So our
the turn, and then
our audio
straighten out
stopped
again as
working.
we
It's
go
okay.
around
We're
the
not going to
bend.
fix it this
This
time.
preserves as much
Essentially,
speed as possible. For
there's an
example,
out loud sort of robotic voice using Amazon text to speech, and it is describing to us why we are positioning in a particular way. And we have a visualization of the what information, so the visualization of that vehicle's racing line. Okay, let's talk about the results. I use statistical analyses, statistical models called linear mixed effects models to see if people in the experimental groups learn to drive differently from before to after coaching from people in the control group. This lets us see the effect of the AV coach's explanations on how well participants learn to drive. The group that got only auditory what explanations with no why rationale significantly improved their positioning relative to the control group, but did significantly worse than the control group in other measures. By contrast, the group that saw the visual racing line and also got rationale for why to position there significantly improved their positioning compared to the control without any other sacrifices in performance. The group that got both auditory what and auditory why information saw no significant differences from control. We also found differences in cognitive load or mental exhaustion between groups and evidence that cognitive load impacted how much someone improved. Lastly, we found that people with higher trust in the AV coach ended up learning and improving more. So what does this mean? I'll sort of distill this all out because I know it's a little complicated. First, it means the experiment was a success. Using an AI driving coach, we were able to help people learn to drive a race car better than practice alone. More than that, we learned a lot about how to design effective communications. So for example, the group who got only auditory what information without rationale for why to position there improved their positioning, but did worse than the control group and everything else. By contrast, that group that got visual what and auditory why information improved positioning and stayed on par with the control group. And I've included p-values there if anybody cares about the statistics. We think this difference comes down to the way information directed attention. So without the why rationale, the what only group focused only on where to position and less on why positioning matters, which is speed and acceleration. When rationale was added, participants were able to spread their attention more appropriately to other aspects of driving and improve more holistically. For design, this is a clear example of what can go wrong if we direct attention without providing people with the necessary context to understand why their attention is being directed. Without context, the what only riders hyper-focused on one task while neglecting other tasks that are still critical. So it's important to design systems that support holistic meaning making so that people can be empowered to focus on what's really important. But you might be thinking to yourself, Rob, you had 2 groups who got why information. Why did only one of them improve? This is where factors related to cognitive overload or mental exhaustion come in. Adding contextual why information was helpful, but when we communicated information using the wrong modality, we ended up with overwhelmed and overloaded participants. So in this case, even though the auditory what, auditory why group had all of the information they needed to succeed, they couldn't take in all of that information because they were being bombarded with too much auditory stimulus and became overloaded. In interview, we learned that visual information was far easier for our participants to integrate than auditory information, perhaps because driving itself is a visual task. So for designers, the main takeaway here is that we need to design efficiently and within the cognitive limits of our riders. And one way to do this is to carefully align the modality of the information we present to the task at hand. So there's a balance. Adding context is good, but not if it causes overwhelm. Stepping out to the broader goals of this dissertation, this study showed us how informational needs can be met based on the broader dynamics of the human AV system. So not only did we learn that we can build an AI driving coach, we also found that the effectiveness of the coach's communications comes down to how well they direct attention, provide context, and present information using the right modality so that it's efficient and avoids overwhelm. Now, as I mentioned briefly, we found that people with high trust learned better than people with low trust. So in the next study I'm going to present, we're going to dig deeper into this concept of trust, which has been a central topic in AI and autonomous vehicles for a long time. And in the study I just talked about, the AI coach's communications were always accurate and the driving context was always the same. So in the next study, we're going to see what happens when this isn't the case by manipulating the accuracy of the information presented and changing up the driving context. So this is shifting us to our second two perspectives, system performance and driving context. And specifically, we're going to be moving away from learning to race and into the domain of communications for everyday driving. And we're going to see what happens to trust when an AV makes a communication error, and if this impact changes when the driving situation changes. So why do we care about errors? Well, the general consensus is that AVs of the future will be better drivers than people. Even if this is the case, the technology is still imperfect. Driving mistakes happen and will likely always happen. And it's well established in the scientific community that when driving mistakes happen, it lowers how much people trust AVs. And this is the same as with other AI systems, like when ChatGPT makes mistakes. What hasn't been studied is what happens when the AV is driving fine, but the communications are wrong. And this is an important question because AI communication errors are inevitable, and we can't safely or ethically deploy AVs without knowing what the consequences are when the communications are wrong. So here's a very basic example of what a communication error may look like inside of our custom AV driving simulator. And once again, our audio is not going to work with us, so I'll just do it out loud.
Braking. There's
So
a
we've got
cyclist
our
crossing the
vehicle.
road.
We can actually see it written there on the screen. So the vehicle out loud is saying braking. There's a cyclist in the road. However, that was not a cyclist. Obviously, that was a pedestrian. So the car drove perfectly fine. It braked when it saw the pedestrian, but it mistakenly called the pedestrian a cyclist. So a very basic communication error. And we wanted to know the impact of communication errors on outcomes related to trust. And we hypothesized that it's not just the presence of an error, but the type of error that would matter. So to test this, we had participants rate videos of driving scenarios across 3 error conditions: an accurate condition where the information was always correct, what we call the low error condition where the AV makes mistakes why it's taking an action, like mistaking a pedestrian for a cyclist, and a high error condition where it mistakes both what and why information. So saying that it's merging right when it's actually braking, and then also calling the pedestrian a cyclist. And most importantly, in each version of the scenario, the vehicle drove exactly the same and made no driving mistakes. So any differences that we see between conditions can be attributed to the communications. So let's add another layer here because this isn't complicated enough. What about driving context? Well, thinking back to our understanding of the complex system, we would hypothesize that the specific driving context would impact trust and also how much an error mattered. So we designed 27 custom driving scenarios based on the most common situations that result in vehicle crashes. These ranged from rural to urban driving and from easy challenges like driving around construction cones to really tough situations like avoiding collisions with erratic drivers. And I want to give a huge thank you to my engineers, Rohan and Sumitra, who did all of the legwork actually programming these out. So we wouldn't have been able to do this without their work. Okay, in order to include driving context as a factor in our statistical analyses, we had participants rate each scenario across 2 dimensions: perceived harm and driving difficulty. So, for example, navigating construction cones was rated as one of our least harmful and least difficult scenarios, while avoiding a side collision with a vehicle at a red light, essentially avoiding getting T-boned, was rated as one of the most harmful and most difficult. So let's talk about the results. What did we find? Each of the 4 graphs here is one of our trust measures, and each line represents an error group. So green is the accurate condition, yellow is the condition where the Y information was messed up, and red is the condition where both what and Y are messed up. And across the board, we found that errors had a huge negative impact on all of our trust measures, and this decrease was proportional with the amount of error presented. So errors decrease people's comfort relying on an AV, increase their desire to take control away from the AV back to themselves, and decrease their satisfaction with the communication. Now, none of this is terribly surprising. What was surprising to us was that even though the AV drove perfectly and exactly the same in each error condition, the presence of communication errors decreased people's evaluations of the AV's driving ability. Now, this crossover effect implies that people form a holistic evaluation of the AV's ability, where errors in one type of performance affects evaluation of other types of performance. And this is actually really important because it validates why we need to get communications right. Even if the car drives perfectly, people won't trust it unless the communications are perfect too. Now, we wanted to get a deeper understanding of how different types of information may have impacted our outcomes. And because we couldn't directly compare the effect of what from the effect of why information because they were paired together, we explicitly asked participants about their individual importance after they finished the rating task. And a lot of feedback followed a similar theme. One participant told us that if the AV described the what action incorrectly, it made them a lot less confident. Whereas when the why was incorrect, it impacted their confidence, but not as much. So what information might be more important than why, but we can't say so conclusively. Now, in a similar vein, we also wanted to know if the implications of an error might impact a person's trust. So we categorized what type errors into 2 groups based on if the AV would have crashed if the vehicle had actually acted upon it. So I'll give an example so we know what that means. In the case that the vehicle was actually braking, if the vehicle had incorrectly said that it was merging to the right, would this result in a crash? In this example on the left, no, the car would end up in an empty lane, so no crash. But if the vehicle had incorrectly said that it was speeding up, would this result in a crash? Yes, the pedestrian would be hit, so there'd be a crash. So there's 2 categories based on the implications of an error. And this analysis had really clear results. The implications of an error matter. Potentially harmful errors lower trust more, even when they're not acted upon. This means a person's decision to rely on an AV may be a part of a more general implicit calculation of the harm that could be caused by a malfunction. So in other words, people are assessing how much an error matters based on the implications of that error in terms of safety. And we thought this was really interesting, and it might actually explain why some people said that what errors were more important than why errors. You can get hurt by an action, but not by a rationale. Switching over to our analysis of context, this analysis supports this notion that potential for harm is central to a person's trust and reliance decision. So in this case, the results were clear. When they were asked directly, participants rated both the perceived harm and driving difficulty of a scenario as important to their decisions, while harm was rated as significantly higher. And using linear mixed effects models, we found higher scenario harm was associated with lower comfort relying on the AV, more desire to take control back away from the AV, and lower confidence ratings. So when there's a higher potential for harm, people trust the AV less. Interestingly, higher difficulty was associated with a lower desire to take control away from the AV, but had no other impact on trust. So when driving is especially difficult, people may want the AV to be in control. Now, at first, we thought this was pretty counterintuitive, but there might be a few explanations. So people might not be confident in their own ability, or people might not want to feel responsible if they feel like a crash is likely. Now, in either case, the implication is that contextual factors impact the way that people are interacting with AVs, with potential for harm playing the more important role for a person's reliance decision. And taking this into our analysis of errors, we found that context acts as a moderator. So when context is more harmful or difficult, errors had a greater impact on trust outcomes. So in other words, people are more sensitive to errors when harm or difficulty are high. So Putting this all together, a person's decision to trust and rely on an AV seems to be based on their confidence in the vehicle's ability, which is influenced by the accuracy of the communications, as well as their assessment of the potential for harm and difficulty of the driving situation. And all of this may be weighed against a person's own confidence that they could perform better than the AV, among other personal traits. So, for example, we found that people with higher expertise tended to have higher trust ratings of the AV. So, personal traits may play a role as well. And we can write this out as a function. So, where someone's trust and reliance decision is based on their subjective estimate of harm. So, with all of these factors contributing to the calculation. Now, how personal traits impact this function is an open question. We saw that expertise may play a role, but in general, we don't know how individual differences will impact how people evaluate the risks and benefits of AVs. So this is what we're going to explore in our next study. Now, for AV designers, the major takeaway is that deploying communication systems with errors can be disastrous, especially what errors and errors with high implications for harm. So improving these systems should be a high priority area of work. Harm and driving difficulty can be used to help categorize contexts, bringing us closer to context-aware communications. These may include presenting information that reassures riders in high harm scenarios or information that validates technical abilities in difficult driving scenarios. And future work can dig deeper into what types of communications should actually be shown in different contexts. And it's important to keep in mind our lessons from study 1. Communications need to be efficient and modality appropriate. So in sum, in this study, we gained a deeper insight into the consequences of communication errors and the impact of contextual factors like harm and driving difficulty on trust and evaluation of the AV. And in particular, we found that trust judgments are closely tied to a person's subjective evaluation of harm. Now, stepping back to our overall dissertation theme, this study helped us understand how trust needs change when the system changes, which helps us understand how to prioritize future communication development and move towards context-aware design so that we can lower subjective assessments of harm. Now, taking this into our third and final study, we're going to dig into this question on how personal traits may impact a person's trust judgments, which is moving us into our third and final perspective. And specifically, we're going to expand our inquiry to include a much wider range of personal traits, and we're going to break down specific subjective risks and benefits. And this is going to give us a more comprehensive understanding of trust foundations and move us towards this idea of personalization. Now, in this case, we wanted to get a better understanding of why a person may lack trust and how different traits or concerns can predict a person's trust judgments. Now, I used survey to collect over 150 different features about a person, ranging from their past experiences, their cognitive attributes, their attitudes on the risks and benefits of AVs, a whole bunch of stuff. And to my knowledge, this was the most diverse and comprehensive data collection effort to date for human AV trust research. And once data was collected and processed, we used machine learning models to classify people based on their level of trust in AVs, and then use the explainable AI technique SHAP, which uses a game theoretic approach to show which features were the most important to our model's predictions. My team collected responses from nearly 2,000 young adults over the course of about 3 months. And you may be wondering, why just young adults? Well, there's 2 reasons. First, we wanted to focus on early adopters and the next generation of AV users, since designing for this group is often considered the most critical. And second, isolating populations allows us to get rid of some superficial characteristics that often obscure the true driving factors of behavior that are unique to a specific population. So, for example, the common finding that age predicts someone's attitudes towards technologies might be true, but it's far less meaningful than the deeper factors that underlie age, like specific experiences, abilities, and concerns. Now, before we can talk about what factors might predict trust, we need to know, is this type of modeling even possible? Can we predict trust from traits? And the answer is yes. And we can do it pretty well. We tried 7 different machine learning techniques based on prior work in the field, and our best models had about an 86% balanced accuracy at classifying a person's trust level, which is actually surprisingly good given this type of messy data. Now, let's get into the interesting stuff. What factors mattered most? Okay, this crazy looking plot here is called a B-swarm plot, and it shows which factors were most important to the model's predictions. So higher on this list means more important. Values to the right are indicative of a person being classified as higher trust, while values to the left are indicative of a person being classified as lower trust. The color refers to the value of the feature itself. So, for example, the most important factor was a person's overall judgment of risks and benefits, which we can see at the top. And we can see that a higher score on this feature, indicated by red, is over to the right. So this tells us that people who see a more positive risk-benefit ratio are more likely to be classified as trusting. And if you're confused by that, don't worry. You don't actually have to remember any of that. I'm going to take you through all of the major takeaways of the analysis and what this all means. This was just for the people who wanted to know how to read this insane-looking graph. Okay, so possibly the most important takeaway is that perceived risks and benefits of AVs by far outweighed any other type of factor for predicting a person's trust. Now, the things I've highlighted here on the screen are all factors related to risks and benefits. And as you can see, of the top 20 factors, 12 of them were related to risk and benefit judgments, which is a lot considering how many factors we had in the model. We found this a bit surprising since there's a lot of work out there that says personality, culture, expertise, our own work that said expertise, cognitive and psychological traits, demographics, that all of these should impact trust. But for us, that didn't seem to be the case. So why? Well, one answer is that appropriately segmenting the population gets rid of some superficial factors like demographics and focuses the results specifically on young adults. The other answer is that factors like personality might appear to be important when you're only studying a few variables, but with a more comprehensive set of variables like the one we have here, those effects may disappear. Now, we did check to see what would happen when risks and benefits were removed from the analysis, and even then, factors like personality and cognitive traits don't seem to matter much. Now, digging deeper into this, we found that the most important risks were concerns with system performance and usability, which goes hand in hand with our insights on harm and errors from the previous study. When people were concerned that the system wouldn't be easy to use, that they wouldn't understand how it was working, or that it wouldn't be able to perform in different contexts, they were less likely to trust AVs. This reinforces our prior conclusions that context-aware communications may be really helpful, and that we need to prioritize for performance and plan for contingencies like errors. Usability is something that HCI researchers and people like UX designers deal with all the time, and our analysis says that this should continue to be a focal point. Now, more complicated to design for are concerns over losing control and lacking understanding in what an AV is doing, since these are foundational to the situational awareness that is held by a writer. In these cases, we can leverage explainable AI and communication design techniques like we talked about in studies 1 and 2 to reassure a writer that they are safe, that the system is performing well, and give agency back to the writer so that they know what an AV is doing and why. On the benefit side, every benefit reported was something that moved beyond what is possible with current human-controlled driving and vehicle infrastructure. So once again, reduction in harm and increased safety was important. So people who thought that AVs would reduce accidents trusted them more. Other important benefits included improving efficiency, fun, and reduction in traffic. Now, in-vehicle displays could reinforce these benefits, perhaps by using tactics similar to those that can be found in existing hybrid and electric vehicles. Now, there's obviously a balance between risks and benefits. It doesn't matter how fun an AV is if it'll crash into a telephone pole. But what we can take away from this is a class of information that can be communicated to riders before or during a ride to calibrate a person's trust and reliance strategy. So notice I said calibrate, not increase. So in many cases, AVs are actually better drivers than humans. But as we talked about, they can make mistakes. So highlighting safety statistics or specific risks and benefits could help people who overtrust or undertrust develop a more appropriate reliance strategy. And central to all of this is a conversation on ethics. We can't just tell people that the cars are safe. They actually need to be safe, and we need to prove it. So transparency is key. People need to be provided with accurate information so that they can make informed decisions. Now, a few other factors showed importance, but none to the same extent as risks and benefits. Unsurprisingly, we found that people who considered AVs more practically feasible, understood their purpose, and who are generally quick to adopt new technologies were more likely to trust AVs. A bit more interesting was how important institutional trust played in people's trust. So people who trusted tech companies, automakers, and the government were more likely to trust AVs. Now, there's a few explanations for this. People may intuitively recognize that AVs will function well if and only if the groups that produce and regulate them will function well. Or some people may just be more dispositionally trusting than others. Both of these interpretations have design implications. So, first, it means that companies and regulators need to show that they have rigorous standards and transparent guidelines so that people can verify that the vehicles are safe. And second, if some people are just more trusting than others, then this is a special group that designers should account for. There are two other factors that I'm going to point out. The first is this factor just generically called mental model, which shows us that people who see AV decision making as more similar to human decision making were more trusting. This leads to the insight that designing interactions that are based on how humans interact with each other may be helpful for building trust. And this is actually the same conclusion that we found in one of my previous studies from a few years ago, where we found that explainable AI systems in radiology were more trusted by radiologists when their communications matched the way other radiologists communicate. Lastly, I want to highlight the factor here, have you ridden in an AV before? Which is at the bottom of our list of factors here, meaning that prior experience matters, but not as much as a lot of the rest of these. This means that Waymo's strategy that says that all we need to do is get people in the cars and they'll learn to trust and they'll learn to trust on their own. That strategy is not actually going to work. So sorry, Waymo. In sum, in this study, we use machine learning to understand the foundations of trust in AVs, including getting a deeper understanding of how people evaluate an AV's risk and benefits. A lot of talking. And this work supported our prior findings that trust and reliance decisions are based on the implications of use in terms of harm and safety. So this helped us form a set of communication and policy principles to build more usable, trustworthy, personalized, and accessible AVs based on different people's risk and benefit profiles. So taking all three of these studies together, I hope that I've shown how different aspects of the complex system, from personal traits and cognitive limits to harm assessments, from errors and context and all of this, how all of these together impact how people interact with AVs and how we can use this understanding to improve human AV interaction. And if I can boil this down to a few overly simple conclusions, AVs will be improved when we give the right information in the right modality at the right time, when they are reliable and contextually flexible enough to lower our subjective assessments of harm, and when we can tune them to meet different people's risk-benefit profiles, including accessible practices and transparent policies. Taking this back to my thesis statement, I expect many of the insights that we talked about today to generalize into other domains. And it's my hope that this work will motivate future studies to improve our interactions with many types of technologies. And that this type of work will help us learn a little bit more about the nature of how people form judgments and interact with machines in the real world. So in the end, I'd like to revise my thesis statement to emphasize that human AI interaction, collaboration, and decision-making for cars, but also in many other domains, could benefit from a deeper understanding of the complex systems within which interactions occur. And with these approaches, we can build AI that can empower their users instead of stripping away agency and meet many diverse needs instead of taking one-size-fits-all approaches. Now, these three studies fit into the larger scope of work that I've been doing over the past few years, which includes AI work in radiology, misinformation prevention, and explainable AI for image classification. And many of these studies support the same conclusion. To build trust and meet informational needs, AI communications must be adaptable to specific people, contexts, and goals. Thank you. Okay, before we actually get to questions, I have a few thank yous myself that I'd like to share. First, I'd like to thank my advisors, David and Nadir, as well as my committee, Jim and David, for their support. I'd also like to thank my collaborators for the projects I presented today, without whom none of this work could have been possible. This is all a team effort. So thank you to all of my collaborators. Um, I'd also like to thank my cohort, especially Michael and Alejandro. Michael, who I co-founded the Cognitive Media Lab with, and Alejandro, who I worked with as part of the Discovery Way Fellowship. Thank you to the new friends who I've met here in San Diego. I've been here for about 5.5 years, and you've all made my time here so much fun. It's good to have friends. Um, uh, thank you to my old friends from ages ago in Ohio and Boston. We grew up together, and you've helped shape the person that I am today. And this includes some of the most outrageous and hilarious people that I've ever met. Your support has always meant so much to me. Thank you to my partner, Ariana. Having you by my side has always, it's been a huge part of this whole process. And I wouldn't have been able to get through many of the different challenges of this PhD without you. So thank you. And of course, thank you to my family, my mom, my dad, my brother, all of which are here today. And of course, thank you to Louie, the puppy. And thank you to my extended family, my other friends, my mentors, the people who weren't pictured here. I'm really grateful for the support that you've all given me. Okay, that's all. Thanks, everybody. We do have a few minutes for insights. We're gonna keep that for is and do some more questions. Nathan and Rob, I didn't see them. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Michael.
How did you know the AS?
All right, well, I guess I asked for that. Just for the people who are on Zoom to make sure that you heard the question. It was, how did I build the AI system for AI coaching from that very first study? So this was actually kind of fun. It also goes along this similar theme of expert-informed AI practices. And so sort of one of the themes that I've been using with this research is to take what experts do in the real world and then model that with machines. And so in this case, I went into that driving simulator, that big Disney ride looking thing. And I sat there with two professional race car drivers. I did separate sessions with them, but professional race car drivers who are real racing coaches. And I sat there while they drove the simulator, and I sat there and I recorded everything and I took notes and everything that they were saying. And essentially, they gave me the intro lesson that we then tried to model with the AI coach. And so this was, it was actually surprisingly difficult because I didn't realize that I get motion sick. So we were in this, and the thing is like rocking us back and forth, and it's this full, like, it's an entire room screen. And I was like, I thought I was going to throw up while I was trying to listen to these coaches who were so nice to take their time to share with me their insights. And the whole time I was thinking I was going to throw up. So luckily I recorded everything and can listen to it later when my head was no longer spinning. But that is how we built the AI coach. It was all modeled after two professional racers who were nice enough to come and join my study. Mother?
I think it's going to take to figure out all these things and actually make self-driving cars a reality?
Okay, so the question on Zoom was, how long is this all going to take? It's a really good question. And I think that we're going to see it in stages, right? So the first stage that we're seeing right now with self-driving cars like Waymos in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, they actually just announced that they're going to be coming to San Diego soon. So we're going to see those around here. So that's sort of what we can think about as stage one. So it's all very centrally held. It's run by essentially one company because Cruise, who is also doing this, went under. So really Waymo is sort of like the big player here. And most of the work that they're doing, it's viable for city driving and for suburban driving. They've only recently started to introduce highway driving. So we're sort of like seeing this go in stages. But right now, it's incremental. So in the next year or so, we're going to possibly see it spreading to more urban environments in the United States. However, in order to get into more rural environments, places where there might be poor signage or tornadoes in Kansas, or like all these things that it's really hard to train the vehicles for, it is going to take a lot longer. Beyond that, when we think about moving outside of the United States, there's a lot of different driving practices that people have in other countries that we don't do here. And so, in order to build models that can actually take these differences into account, it's going to take a lot more time to expand into these other countries, especially countries that have like dirt roads, or that the cars are always like weaving and uh, you know, interrupting each other, like places with bikers, 1,000 bikers in the road, things like that. That's going to be a lot more difficult. And so we're going to see it happen in stages. I don't know if I can give an exact time frame. However, that's sort of what we would expect to happen, and what we should look out for in terms of progression. Any other questions, Nikki? For like for the machine learning stuff? So the question is, who the policies would be. Oh, I think I understand what you're saying. Okay, so for Zoom, the question is, the policy principles that we're talking about, who does this apply for? I actually think the answer is everybody. I think that every single person who's going to interact with these machines um, is going to want transparent policies. I think that's important across the board, especially when we consider things like security practices. Like I don't know if you were able to hear, but at the very beginning, the man in the Waymo that was driving around, the first thing he said was, has this thing been hacked? What's going on? And so security is something that a lot of people are concerned about. And right now that it's not much of an issue because it's all centrally held, but as this type of work expands, that might become more of an issue. And so in general, I think these policy principles are things that are going to be ever more important for everybody so that we can understand how to build these machines to meet everybody's needs and make sure that every single person is able to feel as though they have the information that they require to make decisions. That being said, if we're talking specifically about the generalizability of these models, we can say the conclusions are for young adults. We can't yet generalize this to other groups. I can speculate. I can say most people want more transparent practices than others, but we would have to do additional studies. So this one was focused on young adults. We would have to look at wider populations. Do we have one more question? Yeah. We might have some questions on Zoom. No, okay, you're monitoring online. Okay, great. Any more questions?
No communication to incorrect communication for trust in the AV systems.
So we didn't study that in our study. So essentially the question is what about the difference between just not giving information at all versus giving incorrect communication? That's not something we studied. That's actually something that I really wanted to study. And the big limit for actually all of these studies that are involving human participants is, well, there's a couple limits. One of them is the availability of participants. One of them is funding. One of them is how long it takes to collect information. And so because of that, I chose to focus the study specifically on comparing the different types of errors. But it's a really interesting question. What happens when there's just no communication at all? Is that better than errored communication? And I'm not actually sure, because we know that communications play a role. We know people desire communication in order to build their situational awareness. So we know those are helpful. So is that benefit more than what happens when there's an error? I'm not actually entirely sure. We would have to run a study on it, but it's a great question.
The first study, when the control condition, you had no communication.
Yes.
Can you speculate on that? Or not really? It's too far away.
Yeah, so it's I can't necessarily speculate on the trust stuff from that. But for the group, for the very first study that I was talking about AI coaching, there was a group that got no information and just watched the coach. And when I was talking with all of those participants, because I ran that study in person, I interviewed every single person. And one of the big concerns that was held by the group that got no information at all is that they had a super high amount of uncertainty. They were there and they were worried that they didn't know what was happening. And so I would speculate that even though they were talking about that in terms of learning, I would guess that not knowing what is happening and uncertainty, which is kind of the basis of a lot of these trust issues in the first place, we would see that that would be an issue for trust as well. So I would expect that to generalize, but we would have to look at it empirically.
Okay, so another reason. I want everybody to step out and people in the
Yeah,
leaving. Please don't leave. The people that take long, you know, the podcast.
Okay, so for people on Zoom, the thing that happens now is everybody leaves the room, which means that I will, I could set up a waiting room, I suppose, which would work here. But now is the time that my committee comes and asks me a bunch of questions privately. So
Making me a co-host.
I think you're already a co-host. Okay. So bye, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.